Hello, and welcome to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute's 2021 Capitol Hill Briefing Series. I'm Marco Davis, President and CEO of CHCI. This series is the culmination of CHCI's premier 9-month graduate fellowship program, which offers exceptional Latinos unparalleled exposure to hands-on experience in public policy. This unique fellowship program seeks to enhance participants' leadership abilities, strengthen professional skills, and increase the presence of Latinos in public policy areas, specifically in the areas of health, technology, housing, child welfare, and education. CHCI is thrilled to be able to offer our graduate fellows the opportunity to share their perspectives on policy issues they're passionate about and convene leaders in this work for an informative conversation. We would like to thank our Graduate Fellowship Program sponsors for supporting the program, including Facebook, the PepsiCo Foundation, Casey Family Programs, the Walton Family Foundation, Bristol Myers Squibb, DaVita, Wells Fargo, CVS Health, Fresenius Medical Care, and Bank of America. You can keep today's conversation going by using the hashtag CHCI Fellows on social media. Please visit chci.org to learn more about our graduate fellowship program, as well as our other leadership programs and special events. And we encourage you to reach out to our fellows via LinkedIn to find out more about their policy topic and help them connect with job opportunities for when their program concludes in May. Enjoy the discussion.
Please help me in welcoming Nevada State Assemblywoman representing Nevada's 3rd District, Selena Torres.
Concern that impacts families nationwide. When discussing this concern, one topic that is often left out is families who are on the verge of entering homelessness. Families have to worry about losing their homes due to an unstable housing market that is continuing to recover from the 2008 housing crisis. COVID-19 has done nothing to improve the situation. The virus has impacted many renters and homeowners throughout the nation, increasing the volatility of their housing stability. Women of color, many of whom are the heads of their households, experience the highest rates of unemployment during COVID. With higher unemployment rates, they are more vulnerable to losing their homes and experiencing homelessness. Even prior to COVID, there was already a need to address the lack of housing infrastructure and homelessness in areas across the United States, but especially in Las Vegas, Nevada. Not only is there a need for further policy and infrastructure, but there is also a need for further research to properly address the needs of these communities. This policy briefing aims to address these concerns, led by our moderator. At this time, I would like to welcome our moderator for today's briefing, Sydney Betancourt. Sydney was born and raised in East Las Vegas. She attended the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she received her bachelor's and master's degrees in social work. During both her undergraduate and graduate experience, Sydney demonstrated her passion for housing and homelessness related to policy. She wrote her master's capstone project on Housing First, a popular approach used in the homelessness services industry. Sydney is a CHCI Wells Fargo Housing Graduate Fellow. She did the first half of her fellowship with the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness and is completing the last half of her fellowship with the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Torres, for your kind introduction. I also want to thank you for the strong work you're doing to keep Nevadans housed. For those who don't keep up with Nevada politics, Assemblywoman Torres sponsored Assembly Bill 161 alongside Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong that would end summary evictions, which would assist many individuals and families from losing their homes to an unjust system. Being more than 2,000 miles away from Las Vegas can make me feel very homesick sometimes, but seeing advocates like yourself continuing to fight for families in need of housing in my home state gives me so much hope for its future. My name is Sydney Betancourt. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the 2020-2021 CHCI Wells Fargo Housing Graduate Fellow. I am extremely honored and grateful to be hosting this panel alongside 4 amazing panelists who will be bringing a variety of perspectives on the topic of families in danger of experiencing homelessness. I want to extend a huge thank you to all the attendees and want to welcome you all to the 2021 Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Capitol Hill Policy Briefing Series. This session is titled Gambling with Housing in the Silver State: How Families in Las Vegas and Other Urban Cities Are at Risk for Homelessness. When the housing crisis occurred in 2008, many communities in Nevada were hit hard, including Las Vegas. I was only in 7th grade when this happened, but even at this age, I understood how heavily this was impacting my family. As the eldest daughter of my family and a first-generation student, I was always asked to help translate legal documents and translate for my parents at meetings. To keep our home in 2009, my family had to file for bankruptcy, which, as you all can imagine, is not an easy process for a young child to go through. It wasn't just my family that was experiencing this, as many families of my friends and peers were also struggling to maintain their homes. This lived experience is what continues to fuel my passion for working in the housing and homelessness policy sector, which itself is full of many issues that need addressing. Today's briefing will be focusing on the niche concern of families at risk for experiencing homelessness, while highlighting families in cities like Las Vegas. As I stated earlier, Nevada was one of the hardest hit during the housing crisis. During this time, 25% of homeowners in Las Vegas owed more to the bank than their home was worth, compared to the national rate of 9.1%. Renters also felt the impact of the housing crisis when their landlords would default on their mortgages. Las Vegas has struggled to recover from the housing crisis, and a report as recent as 2019 has indicated that 342 individuals in families experience homelessness on any given night in the city of Las Vegas. This number has likely increased since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The lack of affordable housing in Nevada has left many low-income families of color, and especially single mothers, in a situation where they are more likely to experience homelessness. The pathway from housing to homelessness is made even shorter when Las Vegas families cannot access the hourly wage of $18.85 needed to afford the rising rates of a 2-bedroom apartment in Southern Nevada. Lack of non-congregate shelters or individual family dwelling units are also a concern for families who are beginning to experience homelessness. It is becoming an even bigger concern as COVID-19 impacts safety protocols in standard shelters, necessitating the need for non-congregate shelters. With these concerns, it's important to focus on the need for further federal assistance for families and more funding for infrastructure such as non-congregate housing and shelters. Our panelists today will be speaking further on their ideas of how to limit and prevent families from experiencing homelessness. Before we begin, I want to go over a few reminders regarding our virtual setting. Please feel free to submit your questions using the chat feature to ask any questions that may come up during the event. For the sake of time, we ask that you direct your questions towards a specific speaker. Please feel free to use the hashtag CHCI Housing to join the conversation on social media. With that, I am happy to start introducing our marvelous panel for today, beginning with Lisa Rice from the National Fair Housing Alliance. Lisa Rice of Washington, D.C., leads the National Fair Housing Alliance efforts to advance fair housing principles, preserve and broaden fair housing protections, and expand equal housing opportunities for millions of Americans. She played a major role in crafting sections of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act and in establishing the Office of Fair Lending within the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She also helped lead the investigation and resolution of precedent-setting fair housing cases, which have resulted in the elimination of systemic discriminatory practices involving lending, insurance, rental, and zoning matters. Welcome, Ms. Rice. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Hi, Sydney. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this really important discussion. I'm really honored to be here. Just to give you a little bit of a background about the National Fair Housing Alliance, we are a national civil rights organization dedicated to eliminating all forms of housing discrimination. And we're also the trade association for all fair housing organizations in the nation, including private nonprofit fair housing organizations, community-based groups who work on advancing fair housing issues, as well as government agencies, local commissions of human rights commissions, or civil rights commissions that work to enforce local and state fair housing statutes. So we enforce the nation's fair housing and fair lending laws, and we implement a broad range of programs to both create and expand equitable housing opportunities for everyone in the nation. And we know that homelessness is deeply connected to the legacy of housing discrimination in the United States. That includes federal, state, and local policies, as well as industry practices that created and perpetuated segregation. And not just the segregation of people by race, but also the segregation of resources, opportunity hoarding, if you will. Segregation is not a natural construct in this nation. Segregation was both engineered and designed by literally thousands of policies and laws put in place down through the decades. So policies like and laws like Black codes, Jim Crow laws, racially restrictive covenants, exclusionary zoning ordinances, and many, many other policies delivered us this really deeply segregated and inequitable housing landscape. It is why today our neighborhoods are more segregated than they were 100 years ago. It's why the racial homeownership and wealth gaps are so intractable. In fact, the Black-white homeownership gap is as wide today as it was in 1890. But in addition to the segregation of people in this nation, we also have, as I mentioned, a fundamentally, very deeply ingrained segregation of resources and opportunities. So communities of color are disproportionately health deserts, banking deserts, food, education, water, and employment deserts as well. And so because of deep levels of inequality in our society, often when we implement solutions to try and address a major challenge or crisis, it actually ends up exacerbating inequality and driving disparate outcomes. And we're seeing this right now very profoundly with respect to the COVID pandemic. So the CARES Act and other COVID relief efforts actually ended up widening the inequality gaps for so many communities in the nation because these solutions were developed and or implemented. They were not developed or implemented through an equity standpoint. So it's because of this really legacy of discrimination in our housing and lending markets and our systemically inequitable society that a disproportionate percentage and number of protected class groups like families with children, persons with disabilities, and communities of color are homeless in America or on the brink of homelessness. And so our goal at the National Fair Housing Alliance is really to work with a broad range of stakeholders to dismantle inequitable systems and then to create fair housing opportunities for everybody in our society.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Rice, for your words and for advocating for fair housing throughout the nation. This issue cannot be addressed without addressing and looking at it with a racial equity lens. I would now like to welcome Dr. Beth Shin from Vanderbilt University. Mary Beth, or Beth Shin, is a professor from Vanderbilt University who who studies how to prevent and end homelessness. She was a co-principal investigator of the 12-site Family Options Experiment, examining approaches to ending family homelessness. She was also the evaluator for the initial study of the Pathways Housing First program. She was the developer of a model used by New York City to target its homelessness prevention services. In her 20 book with Jill Kadori, they demonstrate that we have the resources necessary to successfully end homelessness. Welcome, Dr. Shin. You may now proceed with your opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Sydney, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. So as Lisa Rice said, housing in this country is hugely inequitable, and so is homelessness. African Americans and Native Americans are far more likely to become homeless, even relative to their positions in poverty, than white or Asian Americans. And Hispanic Americans are more likely to be doubled up, sharing households with other, sharing the same dwelling unit with other households because they can't afford or find a place of their own. And so just as housing is inequitable, so are these forms of homelessness. As Sydney said, we've tried to look at what ends homelessness for families. And the major finding from the family option study that she mentioned is that housing choice vouchers that hold families' housing costs to 30% of their income not only end homelessness, but have radiating benefits for other aspects of family life. Families who have a secure place to stay can deal with other problems on their own. So families who got access to housing vouchers had less substance abuse, less psychological distress, lower levels of domestic violence, fewer separations of children from their families, better school attendance and behavior for the children, better food security for the family. And all of these benefits accrued simply by making housing affordable for people. The same housing choice vouchers that end homelessness for people who are already experiencing it also prevent homelessness for people who are on the brink. And there's several things we know that prevent homelessness. The housing choice vouchers have the biggest effects, but so do eviction prevention programs. So does a program in New York City called Home Base, which is essentially good old-fashioned social work backed up by some economic resources, hooking families to all of the resources that they're entitled to. Now, those interventions have a little less impact than a whole housing choice voucher because they're more modest. But every study that has looked suggests that we have the most bang for our buck. We have the biggest impact if we give whatever prevention services we have to the people who are worst off. And so it's really important when we think about homelessness prevention that we think not only about people who are well enough off to have a lease from which they can be evicted, but people who are doubled up with other households or simply told to leave by the primary leaseholder or the homeowner because they can no longer contribute their portion of the rent. So the key message of our book and the key message I'd like to convey today is that we know how to end homelessness. We know how to prevent it. It really is a matter of political will. Homelessness is a choice not by people that we find on the street, but by the rest of us when we look the other way.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, for your research on housing families and experiencing homelessness. I also want to thank you for mentioning the importance of the housing vouchers. I now want to introduce our third panelist, Terry Ruth Lindeman. Terry Lindeman is the Executive Director of Family Promise of Las Vegas, which is a national affiliate of Family Promise and serves families with children at risk for homelessness. Terry has over 20 years of local experience related to serving families with children experiencing homelessness. Ms. Lindeman is a partner in the effort to end family homelessness in Clark County, Nevada, through the development and implementation of Housing First programs. Welcome, Ms. Lindeman. You may now proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm very honored to be here today to engage in this discussion. I could not agree with Dr. Shin more in the comments that she made. During the pandemic, we, as everyone stated, experienced an increase in service need in our community and directly to our agency. Almost a 400% increase in services requested. We did receive funding from the CARES Act, which helped greatly with rental assistance and motel shelter. However, in our community, Family Promise has always experienced a higher number of families coming to us from ethnicities which are African American and from Hispanic Latino. And much of that for the Hispanic Latino families is that we have a high number of citizens in our community that work in service-related jobs. When those hotels and casinos shut down, they received some help for a while, but then after that, they were immediately facing challenges of being doubled up, being threatened with evictions from predatory landlords, and created additional stress for these families with children. Another interesting viewpoint that I really hope policyholders will look at is the fact that we have a lot of undocumented workers in Clark County. These families are struggling hard. Many of them have American citizen children, and they have great difficulty locating housing. They are especially vulnerable to landlords that are predatory. I've heard of some specific cases. In the GAP report from the National Alliance for Housing, again, this year, it just came out, Nevada ranks last in available affordable units. For 100 applicants, we have only 20 available. It just, looking at the numbers, this tells us right away that, again, we really have a need in Southern Nevada to expand affordable housing, for policymakers to support inclusionary zoning for projects. And we really must do a better job of providing affordable housing for our most vulnerable in our community. In my next slide, the same report illustrates that 81% are extremely low of our extremely low income renters are cost burdened. This creates an impossible scenario for families to ever catch up. And our goal here at Family Promise is to continue to work with our community to help these families with children not only thrive, but to succeed with accomplishing their housing goals and their employment goals. And affordable housing and housing choice vouchers especially are one of those solutions we need in Southern Nevada.
Thank you, Ms. Lindemann, for the direct work you're doing with families experiencing homelessness in Las Vegas. Last, but certainly not least, I want to introduce our final panelist, Michelle Merced. Michelle Merced is the Chief Executive Officer for Neighborhood Housing Services of Southern Nevada. For the last 12 years, her team has helped over 1,500,000 households purchase their first home by providing down payment assistance, educated over 6,500 families through homebuyer education, and assisted over 650 households in foreclosure prevention services. In addition, Neighborhood Housing Services of Southern Nevada also owns and manages over 150 units of scattered affordable housing throughout Southern Nevada. Welcome, Ms. Merced. You may now proceed with your opening remarks.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Sydney, for having Neighborhood Housing Services on this platform. I'm not necessarily sure if there's anything more I can say after Dr. Shin and Terry, my partner, Terry. Terry and I work closely together as we integrate some of our services. What I can say is that, and most of you already know, Las Vegas is a different market. We are now navigating in a world of which we have not seen before, and the problems that we had prior to COVID-19 has only heightened. So what I am, who I learn from is really the majority of you, and I'm hoping what we get out of it today is how we can extend some of your questions and navigate through this new world through COVID-19 to come up with the solutions to really tackle the problem that we already had, which was the lack of affordable housing. Our world is a little bit different because our focus is on the affordable housing platform. So what we do as an agency is we hope that through the efforts of what we're discussing today, that the policies do change and that we pivot from homelessness to adding more housing here in Southern Nevada. Sydney said something earlier about 7 years ago that she dealt with her family, and it just feels like yesterday that we had to deal with the same market, but even more heightened today because of COVID-19. So again, I just want to thank you so much. I can't echo everybody else, some of the peers that are on the call today, and I'm excited to be here and answer all of your guys' questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Merced, for informing us on the work that your organization is doing to help Southern Nevadans access affordable housing. And I'm eager to hear more about yours and Ms. Liddeman's local perspectives also with some of the questions that we have prepared today. And with that, I would like to begin our Q&A session. I will start off by asking the first few questions, and then I will open it up to the audience. And again, audience, please feel free to engage with any of the panelists, and remember to direct each of your questions towards a specific speaker in the format of the question for the sake of time. And the first question that I have for you all, I know some of you addressed it in your opening remarks, but if you want to go in a little bit deeper, is why is it also important to address the needs of families at risk for experiencing homelessness versus the families that are already experiencing homelessness? And for further context, can you all highlight why it's equally important to invest in prevention services / actions versus direct services? And if each of you want to go ahead and take a stab at that question.
I can answer it first, or it's up to you. So for me, this space is a little bit different because obviously we don't deal with homelessness. But what I can tell you is we understand the bottleneck. For those that are already dealing with homeless, right now for us, it's just a matter about being proactive. Like I said earlier, we haven't seen this before. So to navigate through it, it really is about being proactive. We think of terms of pipeline, and I'll give you an example. You know, how we provide our services is we really do partner with local nonprofits here in town, Terry being one of them. And one of the challenges that we have is we have to make sure that we continue to integrate our services. We are not case managers as a HUD housing counseling agency, which is challenging, but we do rely on our partners like Terry to continue with the work they do as we continue to provide the affordable housing. And I think that that's going to be our biggest challenge, is making sure that we continue to address the need for affordable housing, and we partner with our partners like Terry, so that way we can, for those that don't carry real estate, for our partners, we can help in that platform by integrating our services.
And I would like to respond quickly, Sydney, to that question. 67% of our clients at Family Promise, not only here but across the nation, are always children. If we can keep that family in their own home, whether it be an apartment or their own home, that child will not have to move schools. That child will not suffer education challenges, and we will be just really strengthening that family from experiencing homelessness. It costs less for America to keep someone in their home than it does to let them slide into homelessness, in all ways, socio and economic.
Let me raise one more issue. I couldn't agree more with what the previous speakers have said about the disruption of homelessness and how we can avoid it. But there's another issue, and that is stabilizing communities. So when individuals default on their rent, when they're evicted, small landlords are also at risk. And I don't worry too much about the big corporate landlords, but a lot of mom and pop landlords kind of need the rent to keep their mortgages going. And so if you evict families, if you force families into homelessness, you're also potentially hurting landlords, you're hurting communities. And to the extent that we can stabilize those situations, not only families, but their communities benefit.
Lisa, would you like to add any additional comments?
No, I think everybody has said it all.
Thank you, thank you. And this next question that I have is kind of aimed towards Michelle and Terry, just because you do have that local perspective. But can you describe what you think are some of the biggest and unique barriers to families trying to access affordable housing in Las Vegas?
Terry, you want to take a stab at that? Because you already.
Some of the biggest barriers are they're low-income wage earners, so they don't have the income that a landlord is saying they must have to be in an affordable apartment. We need more subsidized housing for very, very low-income families. They also are having great difficulty at this time finding stable employment. Many people are still on unemployment. And those are two of the biggest barriers. And then just the lack of the units being available. We do not have enough housing stock in this community to meet the needs of the lowest income wage earners.
And I'm just going to echo Terry, because she said it earlier in her presentation. There are 20 rentals available for every 100 extremely low income households. That's huge. And then you take into account that Nevada ranks 44th in the affordability of homes, which may explain why Nevada also ranks 48th in the homeownership rate. And then there's another one. Nevada's 51st in the high cost mortgage loans. So it's kind of twofold. It's kind of, what are the barriers to families? And then what are some of the barriers that the local nonprofits are dealing with? Since we deal in the house or in the space of affordable housing, you know, I'm 97% occupied in the units that we currently offer. If I could provide more to Terry, I would. But the challenge is I've also got probably 30 plus other nonprofits that are saying, I need help. Where I try and wrap my brain around, wouldn't it be nice if some of the for-profits that carry the bigger tranche of inventory were kind of given some type of incentive to provide some affordable housing? Because we are in, it's talk about pandemic. It's a pandemic not only of COVID, but it's a pandemic of the lack of affordable housing. Just yesterday, we had a man come to the door and say he's living in the car with his daughter. And even though it's not a joke, it's sad, but the new affordable housing is a vehicle, like literally a car for some of these people. And we see it, and we've got to figure out how to fix it. That's why we're here today.
And that's a really good segue, because I was going to ask, and I think both Dr. Shin and Lisa can kind of help address this question, but how does policy at a federal level play a role in the lives of families at risk for homelessness?
Sure, I can start with respect to responding to that question, because it really is an important question. Not only do federal policies have to address the challenges, the unique challenges that families are facing, but those policies have to be implemented the right way, right? The CARES Act and then the recent American Rescue Plan Act are great examples to lift up, I think, in response to your question, Sydney. So the CARES Act did not include, for example, rental housing assistance funds. It didn't include a homeownership assistance fund and other really important housing-related measures to help address the unique challenges we're facing. While the CARES Act did include measures to attempt to block evictions and foreclosures, it really just kicked the can down the road, right? And it set up this scenario for a deluge of evictions and foreclosures at the end of those moratoriums. But if you take a look at the recently passed American Rescue Plan Act, it includes $25 billion for rental assistance, $10 billion for homeowners assistance, $100 million for housing counseling, $20 million to advance fair housing and housing equity in America. So, and then these efforts are being implemented against the backdrop of the Biden administration's recent racial equity executive order and fair housing memorandum, meaning that these federal policies, the federal agencies implementing these policies and the states who are disseminating the funds will need to ensure that these funds really are getting at the most vulnerable populations when they're implementing this funding. That's critically important because the one thing that the COVID crisis has taught us, and the relief that has come into play in response to the crisis, is a rising tide does not lift all boats. We saw that with the Paycheck Protection Program. Here's this multi-billion-dollar program that was implemented to supposedly help businesses, and in particular small-owned businesses, but it really did not serve the most vulnerable groups. And we're trying hard to implement those funds and make sure that they get to the most vulnerable populations. So when the Paycheck Protection Program was first implemented, experts reported that roughly 90% of Latino and 95% of Black-owned businesses were not even able to access the program because it was largely implemented through an inequitable banking system that favored those with not only existing banking relationships, but those who were already operating within the financial mainstream. So not necessarily those who most needed the funding. So I think it's really important that this time around, what we're seeing is that federal policies we're putting in place the kinds of federal policies that we need, like the Homeowners Assistance Fund, like the Renter Payment Assistance Fund, but we're also making sure that those programs are being implemented in an equitable fashion so they really are targeted to and prioritizing the most vulnerable populations in our society.
Mm-hmm. That's so important. And one other thing that the American Rescue Plan does that's really useful is it introduces child allowances. And those allowances aren't large enough to pay the rent, but they are large enough to help a lot of families climb out of poverty. And they're not work tested, so that they go to people who aren't able to work or who have young children or who, that they need to care for, or who can't find work. You can still get that kind of help. So that's really important as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for both of you for speaking up on that. Did anybody else want to take a stab at that question, or am I okay to move to the next one? Great. Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I think kind of tying in a little bit of what you were talking about, Lisa, one of the last questions that I want to ask before addressing some of the audience questions would be, how can homeowners hold policymakers accountable in creating equitable housing policies that will keep vulnerable communities of color housed?
Yeah, that's a hard one because the way that people and communities really hold elected officials' feet to the fire is by speaking up and by being organized and being well organized. That's hard to do in the middle of a pandemic. So it has become profoundly important for people to get connected to community organizations and national organizations like ours. that really work to advance equitable housing policies and ensure that benefits and provisions are really directed and really do get to um, the most vulnerable populations. You know, I mentioned in my previous response the PPP program. Well, we know one of the reasons why it was hard to really monitor the effectiveness and the efficacy of that program is because the SBA stopped collecting data that would allow us to hold that federal agency accountable. And so it took national organizations and the voice of, organizing people at the ground level to compel Congress to make the SBA collect that data so that we could really see what was happening. So it's really important, I think, that people get connected not only at the local level, but also at the federal level. And then the last thing I'll say is, quite frankly, I think that the recent changes that we have seen in terms of the political landscape in our society have been a direct result from the people calling out for equity. The Black Lives Matter movement, the call for justice in the Native American communities, the call for justice in our immigration policies. I mean, people took to the streets to demand equity and justice, and we're seeing that take place because people have been standing up and speaking out, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. And you can definitely see how that contributes to everything within these housing systems. And I do really appreciate that you brought up that it's important to have these connections with a lot of local organizations. And with that, I kind of want to turn my attention back to both Michelle and Terry, who are working with a lot of different organizations within Las Vegas. What is your organization doing, in addition to what you've already said, as well as other housing organizations that you're working with to minimize the impact of the current economic crisis on families at risk for homelessness? That was a really long question, so if you need me to break it down, it's okay.
So I'm gonna touch back on what Lisa said earlier, because I just want to add to that, because I believe it really is about just transparency on both ends. One, and two, I'm with Lisa. Join a board, join a committee, get involved, volunteer. Don't just volunteer on Thanksgiving or Christmas. I can tell you from my standpoint, and I know Terry, we rely on those volunteers. And it helps out tremendously. So get involved. I just want to add to what Lisa said. As far as what Neighborhood Housing Services is doing, it's almost kind of like, and I know Terry's going to laugh at this, what space haven't we been in the last year, right? So what I can tell you is the first round of the CARES Housing Assistance Program ended as of December 31st. CHAP is what they call it. That is now being administered by the county. What we're doing, though, is I just received it. We got our agreement with the city of Henderson. So we will be deploying utility assistance to those in the city of Henderson through the CARES Act. In addition to, we are working with the city of North Las Vegas to do our next round of acquiring single family homes, probably anywhere between 4 to 5, depending on where our market is, to serve more of the family. Because I think that's our biggest challenge. And I know Terry knows this, is our units right now, the 1 to 150, the majority are 1 to 2 bedrooms. The lack of 3+ bedrooms to serve our clients, such as Family Promise, is growing. And it's a challenge all across the valley for family housing. So we're working with the city of North Las Vegas to acquire single family homes to help the need for family housing. And then this coming April, we're going to break ground for a 60-unit senior housing for affordable senior housing units that should be ready by 2022. I can tell you from our standpoint, if we can acquire faster, build faster, get rid of the red tape faster, we would be able to help out more people. The challenge is a lot of things are a little older and antiquated, and we are at lightning speed. I can tell you from our standpoint, we do what Sydney said earlier with only 10 people. I don't know how many Terry has now, but to do what we do is pretty amazing. So the volunteers help, get involved help, all of the above helps.
And Terry, if you want to add to that.
Yes, I had to unmute myself, sorry.
That's okay.
Absolutely. Our response has been during this tsunami of numbers of families facing homelessness. We did have congregate shelters in the past. We had to close those due to COVID. We have assisted from March 12th of 2020 to December 31 of 2020, over 1,000 parents and children. And that it was a huge increase for our agency, because that is approximately the number we served in all 3 of the previous years put together. Sadly, though, we do have rental assistance dollars that came in through the CARES Act. Keeping families in their homes is primarily how that funding was used. And that was a very good use for that. For sheltering, it was motel shelter. That is not our desired option for families. We don't believe that families should be raised in a weekly motel. So we really, again, need to develop resources to get these families into affordable housing in our community. One project that we're working on right now, we are building a 10,000 square foot family navigation center with the assistance of Nevada Hand as project manager. We will have at least 10 on-site transitional units. So we will be adding some housing stock. But very important added to this housing is the case management support that keeps people housed and helps them go forward. And one of my wishes for policymakers would be, whenever they give money for programs for the rental assistance, please remember that we have to hire staff to administer these programs. As Michelle said, they do an amazing job. They are our go-to landlord in this community. She says she has 10 staff. We have 6 working on all of these programs, double time. And so that's a big issue. We need to support operations within the nonprofit structure.
Thank you both for sharing what you're doing within the local Las Vegas community. With the remaining time that we have left, I want to focus on audience questions. Again, audience, please feel free to use the chat feature to submit your questions. And as a reminder, for the sake of time, attempt to direct your questions towards a specific panelist. I will begin by asking some questions that came in from participants during registration, with the first one being, what are some ways that individuals can help those that are experiencing housing inequality in our communities? And I think this is like for just like the everyday person. I know you said a volunteer earlier, Michelle. If there's anything else that you would like to add.
You know, I attended a town hall meeting the other day. And I don't know, Terry, if you got to do it, but it was really interesting because it was an open town hall, which I was really glad, 1, I attended, and 2, I wish more people knew about it. And they talked about the new money that's coming and and they were able to even ask those questions of, if I have an application in process or in the queue for rental assistance, how quickly will it be addressed? Because obviously the county at this point has taken over, but there's so many that kind of didn't get an answer at the very tail end of the first money. One of the things they said, who they brought to the panel, which was great, was legal aid. For those here locally, I will say, I can't really say bombard legal aid, but come up with your questions, identify exactly who you can speak to if you're facing that, and contact legal aid. I can't speak on behalf of that. I have my opinions, but legal aid is such a huge resource. And then another one that not a lot of people take advantage of which me and my staff were talking about, is 211. It's there. It can be used. Take advantage of it and and share the feeds. Social media is powerful. And one of the things that I tell my staff is, yeah, we do some great things, but guess what? There are other agencies out there, our partners, that, share the feed that there's a food bank, share that, I don't know how many times I've referred to Terry, because we don't offer those services, but I can tell you, find out who the person is that you need to contact, and squeaky wheel. There, that's a big one recently. Be the squeaky wheel.
And I'll go ahead and move to the second registration question that we received. I think this kind of touches on the federal policy that we discussed earlier, but looking forward is, how can a recovery/infrastructure package address the housing needs of families in Las Vegas, or any city for that matter?
Sure. I think one of the things that is important for the infrastructure bill is that it include measures for the development of affordable housing, and includes measures to address some of the barriers that we see in terms of the development and preservation of affordable housing. I am originally from, although I live in Washington, D.C., I'm from Toledo, Ohio. And Toledo is the kind of community that we see in many areas throughout the United States, where there is a bevy of existing affordable housing stock, but it's really substandard. And in order to bring that existing housing stock up to code and to really make it safe and habitable for people, and in particular for families, you have to have some investment there. There's a great opportunity for a comprehensive, holistic infrastructure package to address those kinds of issues. Now, along with that, I will also say, because one of the other challenges that we face with respect to ensuring that communities are well-resourced is just upgrading systems, and in particular, communities of color, Native American communities, disproportionately have contaminated land, air, and water. And that is something that we can and should address in a federal infrastructure package.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that question as well? No. Okay, I'm gonna move to a question submitted by Israel on Facebook. This one is for you, Lisa. It says, can you describe how the uncertainty of the current housing market can cause problems for a family's housing security? And do you think this will cause another foreclosure crisis across the country?
Thank you so much, Israel. That's a great question. And we are trying to prevent that foreclosure crisis. That's why thousands of organizations banded together and organized to ensure that we would have a homeownership, a homeowners assistance fund, and a rental housing assistance fund, and adequate funds for housing counseling in the recent COVID package. We weren't going to get all of that, quite frankly, but because people organized, we got those resources. Yeah, so I think one of my colleagues already noted that before the COVID crisis hit, we were already in a housing crisis situation with respect to affordable housing. But in addition to that, we have seen communities beginning to, unfortunately, block the path for housing stability. So, for example, there are communities that are passing ordinances right now, and even states passing ordinances that make it legal for landlords to, for example, deny housing choice vouchers. So you come and present with a housing choice voucher or some other form of housing subsidy, and there are many people who want to make it legal for a landlord to deny housing options for families who are using those subsidies. Those are the kinds of things that we need to stop from happening, and we can use, in many instances, the Federal Fair Housing Act or state fair housing laws to prevent that from happening. But if we don't know about it, then we can't use the law to prevent those kinds of barriers from being put in place. So I want to call on people to stand up, file a complaint. Even if you do it anonymously, you can go to our website and file a complaint anonymously. But please let us know when you're seeing barriers to housing access like this, so that we can address those situations. Yeah, if we don't band together and block these kinds of measures, we definitely will see another foreclosure crisis and the continuation of our evictions crisis that was already well underway before the COVID crisis hit. So one point one factoid I think I should share. I mean, everybody was so impacted, I think, by the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis. We have more evictions than we ever had of foreclosures during the height of the foreclosure crisis. So that's how troubled our housing landscape is.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that factoid, Lisa. I want to move to the next audience question. This one's from Myra on YouTube. It says, this one's for Dr. Shin. It says, the annual homelessness assessment report, also known as the AHAR, was released for 2020 last week and indicated a rise in family homelessness, I think, across the nation from what I read. So how do you think this is and will impact homeless service providers?
Mm-hmm. And I'd say you ain't seen nothing yet. So the report that was just released is based on what's called the point in time count that was done January 14 months ago. And already we were seeing homelessness on the rise and family homelessness on the rise and unsheltered family homelessness on the rise. Thankfully, most families who experience homelessness are at least in shelters, but unsheltered homelessness was already on the rise 14 months ago before COVID really struck. And COVID has had a devastating impact on the homeless service sector. I mean, congregate shelters are COVID hotspots. And so many have had to close or to reduce capacity. Many winter shelter programs are provided by congregations. People aren't willing to bring or able to bring folks into church basements during COVID and feel that they can do that safely. So unsheltered homelessness is really on the rise. The CDC has said, don't try to disrupt those encampments right now. Folks are safer in encampments than they are if you force them into homeless shelters that are congregate shelters. So I think we're facing a real crisis. We're not really going to see it because HUD granted most communities waivers from doing the count this year. Most communities didn't feel it was safe to go out and try to do the counts this year. But all the anecdotes that are coming in from around the country say that homelessness and unsheltered homelessness is on the rise.
Thank you for sharing that information and for defining what the PIC count is, because I know it's a really popular term within the homelessness services community, but not a lot of people like on the outside would know what it is. So the next question that we have here from the audience, I have from Javier on YouTube, and this one's for Michelle. If you could dig deeper on how greater investment in public housing infrastructure can help families at risk for homelessness.
Thanks, Javier, for the question. I can tell you from my perspective, it's about being proactive. So just so you know, for us as because we're on both sides, we're on the housing side for pre-purchase counseling and the down payment, and then we're also for affordable housing. So your question is greater investment in public housing infrastructure. How the challenge for us is how do we develop quicker and how do we acquire faster? At the end of the day, I try and tell my peers, because everybody, and I know for those of us that are CEOs, when I say, Michelle, what do you do for a living? Oh, I run a nonprofit organization. It's kind of like oh, I'm sorry. I chose it and we still get paid. But it's just, the difference is Coca-Cola sells Coke, I work for the community. My goal is to help the community, right? The challenge I have is the constant red tape. One, I'll give you an example. We're developing the senior housing project, 60 units. It's taken almost 3 years. Why is it taking 3 years to develop 60 units? And for those of you that are listening and watching, you're talking about 5 different gap financing. 5 different gap financing that I either had to write a grant, go to council, make sure that they approve it, 5 different grants, then get awarded. And I know Terry feels this. It's either we raise money, we fundraise. I'm about to go on the street just to see how much more money we can raise. We can raise to help out the community. So it really is trying to limit the red tape, making it easier for the nonprofits to access the funds. So that way, the end result is really helping more people. The fact that Nevada has a lack of affordable housing and that people are living in their car, when is it enough? And I saw that on Twitter yesterday. When is enough enough? It is where we live, and we have to be able to get involved and choose how to move the needle and make it easier for the end result, which is the community, to develop more affordable housing. Again, the challenge, and hopefully I answered your question, is there's a lot of red tape that a lot of people don't really necessarily know. You talk to somebody else and they say, well, why don't you go ahead and build? Why is it taking you so long to develop? It's not as easy as just saying, I've got a $15 million pot of money to develop housing, or we would have already done it.
That is very true. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Michelle. We're going to see how much time we have left, but this may be the last question. This is from Jacqueline at LinkedIn. She says hello from California, or they say hello from California. How can public agencies partner with housing developers and renting companies / landlords to ensure those with lower economic opportunities have the means for home ownership or realistic renting prices?
So I'll lift up one thing that we haven't lifted up yet in our discussion, which we're finding is a huge barrier, and that is technology bias. We are bringing more and more cases. I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the cases that we have brought to challenge bias in the technologies that are used in the housing and financial services space. But what we are seeing is an increased reliance on technologies in order to determine either eligibility for consumers in terms of their access to housing or what price point they will pay. So an over-reliance on tenant screening and selection services, which have a discriminatory impact on consumers of color because communities of color are over-policed, and a lot of these tenant selection screening devices will establish a red flag. So flag you if you were just arrested. So no conviction, but if you were arrested and you have a record, a criminal record, you'll be flagged and determined to not be eligible. But also there's an over-reliance on credit scoring mechanisms to determine eligibility and pricing. And that is problematic because communities of color and underserved groups, people with disabilities, single female-headed households, these are underserved groups who disproportionately are either credit invisible or they have lived in communities that are credit deserts, and because of that, they have artificially deflated credit scores. And that all exacerbates this issue of people being able to access housing or pay a fair price for their housing opportunities. It's a challenge that is growing. And it is impacting more and more people. And I am afraid that because of the COVID crisis, we're going to see this issue being exacerbated.
Great. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I want to thank the audience for the excellent questions today. I'm happy to see that there's a lot of eager folks that want to continue this discussion, and I hope that you all will after this briefing series. So as we near the end of our session today, I want to return the attention to all of you, our lovely panelists, and give each one of you a minute to speak your final words. So panelists, if you would have our audience take away only one thing from today's panel, what would that be? And Lisa, let's start with you.
Well, I just want to reiterate a point that we made earlier, and that is to encourage folks to get involved. If it isn't volunteering at your local, a local community-based organization, or getting out in the streets and organizing around a particular issue, even if it's just as little as submitting an anonymous complaint about a discriminatory housing practice or a barrier that you're seeing that is precluding people's access to housing opportunities, we encourage people to please get involved, because that's the only way we're going to make change. And thank you again, Sydney, for inviting me to participate in this important conversation.
Of course, thank you for being here. Dr. Shin, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. Well, let me raise something that hasn't really been raised, and that is this: despite the brilliance of our nonprofit housing developers, developers can't afford to create housing that poor people can afford to rent without some help. We need some subsidies from the federal or the state or the local government. And so one thing that individuals can do is to lobby their policymakers to create the resources that we need for developers to develop low-income housing and to subsidize rents for people who can't afford them on their own.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shin. Terry?
Whoops. There. Thank you. Yes. I would like to remind everyone that every child deserves a home. They deserve to be tucked into their own bed at night, not a shelter bed. And I would also like to ask everyone that ever hears about a town hall that is discussing a local project in your community, support it, show up. Usually the people that show up are the ones that are against it. But we can tip that discussion just by supporting our builders, our nonprofit developers. And that's how we're going to change our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. And Michelle?
I don't necessarily know if there's anything else to say. I think and it's hard to say if anything positive came out of COVID, right? But I was taught that there is, but there is a bad, there's a good. And the good thing is it's like, for example, this platform, it's made it easier for us to show up. So the excuse of not showing up anymore, I would say you just can't use it anymore. There's so many ways to show up. So I'm going to echo my peers. Get involved. Identify ways to collaborate. I think that is huge. Not just, when I say collaborate, we collaborate with for-profit entities and we try and figure out how to align our goals. Continue to advocate. Join a board with one of your local nonprofits, join a committee with one of your local nonprofits. And again, like Terry said, I 100% agree with her. Show up. You don't have any excuse anymore. Look, we're virtual and everybody's in every different location. So just show up and ask questions. It's big.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I want to thank each of our expert panelists who have taken the time to be here today. Your knowledge is appreciated and useful in navigating this discussion and moving it forward. And I also want to thank everyone at CHCI who helped me put this event together. An important step in eliminating homelessness is reaching those vulnerable families who are at higher risk of losing their housing before they lose it, especially in Las Vegas, where the eviction rate is almost 15% in some areas. However, this is only possible if we look at the bigger picture and address problems already existing within the housing systems and industries. To all the guests that have attended today, I know there was a lot of information presented to you, but I ask that you keep in mind that addressing the issue of homelessness involves both direct services and preventative measures. We discussed many of those preventative measures today, which included increasing the housing infrastructure, making sure that we have the affordable housing, and that there is the federal assistance as well as the local and state assistance to fuel these initiatives. These measures will not only assist the 342 families experiencing homelessness in Las Vegas, but it will also help the almost 172,000 families nationwide that are experiencing homelessness. While the recent American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 will address pressing concerns like emergency rental assistance, it's important to continue advocating for long-term solutions at all levels of government, including federal, state, and local. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today and engaging in this conversation. I highly encourage our audience members to tune in tomorrow as we continue our CHCI Capitol Hill Policy Briefing Series with our Child Welfare and Education Fellows. Stay healthy and enjoy the rest of your day.